Good afternoon and welcome to the FlexPro Group's web series event entitled Project Stakeholder Management. My name is Richard Ellis and I am the Manager of Marketing and Business Development for the FlexPro Group. I'll be your host today along with your moderator. Thank you so much for joining us. So before we start, we'll be using the Livestorm platform today. As you see in your window, you have the chat, questions, polls, and people tab to your right. We ask you to use the questions tab to anonymously ask questions during Q&A at any point during the presentation. Otherwise, to make general comments to the group or members of the FlexPro group, feel free to use the chat tab. Make sure over the course of the event, you use the polls tab to take the polls. There should be coming out over the course of just this 20-minute presentation. And then finally, for those of you who'd like to view it again, or even those who haven't been able to attend, you'll have a recording of the webinar to be emailed to you at the conclusion of the event. Today's webinar will be sponsored and presented by the FlexPro Group, delivering project management expertise to the life sciences. You can visit us at theflexprogroup.com or follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, or Twitter. Your speakers today will be CEO Rose Cook, Senior Project Manager Ken Sabata, and myself. And just some key learnings for today. Number one, why stakeholder management? Why is it so important? What are the steps to identify and assess key stakeholders? And then ultimately, how do we go about managing, leveraging, and handling key stakeholders over the course of the project? At this point, it's my pleasure to introduce the CEO of the FlexPro Group, Rose Cook.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining. Stakeholder management is an important aspect of every project, and most projects you work on will involve multiple stakeholders, and each one's involvement potentially has the ability to either speed up, slow down, or completely obstruct your progress and must be managed effectively. Stakeholders may not be in the driver's seat, be extremely useful advocates, sponsors, and agents of change. What you may not appreciate, however, is just how deep the benefits of effective stakeholder management can run. The process of managing stakeholders can be viewed by project managers as a form of risk management. After all, keeping your stakeholders happy and meeting their expectations will certainly reduce the risk of negative influences affecting your project. Good stakeholder management will not only clear the path of potential obstructions, it will actively support swift progress and ultimately improve the quality of the results that you deliver. However, it's not simply a case of keeping stakeholders happy. It's also about using their time, their expertise, and their influence to help you reach your goals. And understanding this is arguably what separates the very best project managers from the average performers. I'm now going to turn it over to Ken Sabata to take you through the process of stakeholder management.
Good afternoon. Project stakeholder management involves three elements: stakeholder identification, stakeholder analysis and planning, and managing stakeholder engagement. Managing stakeholder engagement is where we will focus here by way of case study on the soft skills for managing a diversity of stakeholders having a range of power, influence, and interest in your project. The PMBOK Guide, 5th edition, introduced stakeholder management as a distinct knowledge area, highlighting the critical importance of the PM's interactions with and management of this group. Before we can manage stakeholder engagement, we need to identify them and assess their role and involvement. In stakeholder identification, you're discovering the key individuals who are or could be connected to your project. This is done at the project initiation and ongoing throughout the project. Stakeholder analysis and planning is where you determine their requirements, their expectations, their influence and power and interest. And then you're going to plan how you're going to interact with them, with these project stakeholders. Again, this is done at the outset of the project and on a regular basis in order to track changes in their attitudes over time. The stakeholder engagement. This is providing a basis for communication and cooperation with the key individuals connected to your project. This is done throughout the project lifecycle. Why do we manage stakeholders? Because the success of any project is usually judged by how satisfied stakeholders are, and hence our projects won't be successful without significant continuous interaction with stakeholders. When stakeholders have different issues and objectives, keeping everyone happy is not straightforward. The project manager needs to build and maintain positive relationships with stakeholders and make sure they continue to be involved in the project at the level necessary to make it a success. We're going to come back to the level necessary later in the presentation. For now, let's identify our stakeholders. So who are these stakeholders? It varies by project and over the life cycle of the project. Stakeholders are the people, groups, and organizations that could impact or be impacted by a decision, activity, or outcome of the project. This includes the project sponsor, customers, vendors, CROs, CMOs, the list goes on. The first step is to identify all of them as early as possible, because any stakeholders who are missing will certainly be found later, and when discovered, they can likely request changes, which may result in cost and time overruns. Over the life cycle of the project, a project manager should monitor whether the stakeholders have changed in terms of roles in the organization, been replaced, had a change in power or interest. Now that we've identified them, we must now analyze them. In stakeholder analysis, we identify relevant information such as their role, department, knowledge, expectations, influence, and interest level. We assess the potential impact or support each stakeholder could generate. You're going to want to differentiate between decision makers with actual responsibility and positional power to make the decisions versus opinion or knowledge leaders who can influence and may actually be generally more accessible, versus personnel having a vested interest in the outcome versus personnel involved in delivering the outcome. Please remember that absolute power is a myth. Every executive depends on a group of advisors or those with whom they cannot operate. They are accountable to a wide variety of interest groups. Further, they may be influenced by the nature of the information they receive, how it's reported, the company politics, not to mention their own beliefs and ideologies. Key component of your analysis is to assess the level of influence and interest. This is best done in one-on-one, face-to-face discussion, but in addition, discussions with team members, other stakeholders, as well as project management colleagues can provide valuable insights and information regarding stakeholders' power and interest. Let's take a few minutes and better understand how we can categorize stakeholders based on their power and interest. There's many classification models out in the industry that can be used to create a framework for planning how these stakeholders can be managed. But for today's example, we're going to use a simple power versus interest grid. On the y-axis is where the level of influence and power increases as you move up, and on the x-axis increases as we move to the right. Starting in the upper right-hand quadrant and moving in counterclockwise fashion, you have high power and high interest. A good working relationship is essential for the project to succeed with these stakeholders. You'll want to engage closely with them throughout the project. Moving in counterclockwise fashion, you'll want to take a look at the high power and lower interest stakeholders. These stakeholders represent a risk to your project success. You need to understand what they want and expect. You'll want to measure and adjust communication with this group of stakeholders to keep them satisfied, but also avoid over communication such that they become bored with your message. As we continue moving in a counterclockwise fashion, stakeholders with both low power and low influence. Don't forget these stakeholders. They do require limited monitoring and modest interaction, but reevaluate them to see if that changes over time. And then finally, the stakeholders in the lower right-hand quadrant. These have low power but high interest. You want to keep them adequately informed and talk to them to ensure that they're arising. These stakeholders can be very helpful with details of your project. The next few slides will introduce a project and some characters, followed by an outline of the situation. As we go through this case study, please think of your own projects and situations. We'd welcome your comments and most especially your questions at the end. The project is the complete renovation of the laboratory facility supporting the quality function at a pharmaceutical company. The project's underway and up until now has been self-managed by the laboratory personnel. The lab personnel no longer are working as laboratory personnel because the facility has been decommissioned. They have limited experience in restarting a lab. They want their operational lab back and to return to the comfort zone and their functional expertise. And they have very little interest in performing the project work necessary to achieve that goal. The individuals on this team want their lab back up and running, but they're not sure how to make that happen in this team environment. They're very unfamiliar. Before we go any further, let me remind everyone that the situation and characters are based on real life experience of FlexPro colleagues, but they are a mesh of multiple experiences. As is said in TV productions, any similarity to actual situations, persons living or dead, or the actual firms is purely coincidental. The scenarios provide an opportunity to stimulate conversation about managing stakeholders with your colleagues wherever you're located. So let me first introduce Paula, an experienced PM. She's been brought in midstream as the team has not been successful in meeting the schedules or capabilities needed by the company. Paula is experienced PM with an impressive record of successes working with cross-functional subject matter experts. Now let's meet her three stakeholders: Motivator Molly, Micromanager Mike, and End Around Ed. Our first case study, we're going to focus on Molly. Molly's the director of QA and the project sponsor. She is both interested and powerful. She does stay at arm's length though, letting Paula manage the project, reviewing the regular updates on status and issues via the communication plan that Paula established. Paula's assessment: Molly is an enthusiastic supporter of the project and has the functional power and influence as this group and the project are within her domain. She is very interested as well as vested in a positive outcome. Finally, Paula determined to engage with her throughout the project as she clearly falls into the engage closely quadrant. This is the engagement level necessary for Molly. Fortunately, the communication plan and the on-request support approach works with Molly. The situation is this though: Paula continues to struggle to get the team to deliver. She decides to engage Molly to secure her direct engagement with the team and assist in their motivation. As I said before, the majority of the team members are lab scientists, and the recommissioning of the lab is outside their comfort zone. There is a level of mild frustration as they just want to get it done. Molly does meet with the team to discuss concerns and how to move forward with the project. Paula's assessment was spot on. The outcome is that a dose of functional management position power is what it took to get the team motivated and understand that they needed to work with Paula moving forward. Now in our second case study, we meet Micromanager Mike. Mike is the VP of Supply Chain, also an enthusiastic supporter of the project. His supply chain has been negatively impacted by the temporary closure of the QA lab. He wants the lab up and running, and he wants it now. Before we review the situation, let's be clear. Mike was receiving regular project updates, just as described earlier from Molly. Paula originally assessed Mike as someone in the keep satisfied quadrant, but as this situation unfolds, she quickly reassessed his engagement as someone who was over-involved and became a project disruptor. As we review the situation, you will see Paula needs to adjust her engagement level with Mike, at least temporarily. Mike was hypersensitive to the progress. He sought information on the status of the project from anyone and everyone, including official hallway notification, thus disregarding the communication plan. Additionally, he directed individuals on the team to initiate or terminate activities based on unreliable sources of information and his own opinion about how things should be done. Mike pressed his concerns to other senior leaders, essentially everyone but Paula. Paula decided to confront Mike immediately. So to be clear, confront is not confrontational. It is immediate, direct, and constructive engagement. Immediate means deal with it as soon as possible. A problem is not like wine and cheese and won't improve with age. Without attention to a problem, it leads to spoilage. Direct means not via intermediary and not via email. Meet and call out the 500-pound gorilla in the room. Hints aren't going to work. And constructive. So what can you reasonably do to alleviate this stakeholder's unease? There's nothing to be gained by challenging his authority. The outcome, Paula confirms Mike is getting his information outside of the agreed upon communication plan and from a project team member who has their own agenda. She secures his agreement to take actions based on communications with her moving forward. Paula will need to continuously engage Mike to keep him satisfied from his enthusiastic support. She had been burning valuable bandwidth managing misinformation rather than managing the project. In the final case study, we meet End Around Ed. Ed is a member of the project team, but he's also the functional manager of the lab. So he is both a core team member and the customer of the end product. He reports directly to Molly, the project sponsor. The situation is this: Paula and the team members, many of whom are subject matter experts in various aspects of the lab and its equipment, have disagreed with him at times on a number of aspects of the project plan. Ed is not happy with the progress that the team is making and has gone around both Paula and Molly to Mike, the VP of supply chain, to complain. In Paula's initial assessment, she thought Ed was a friend of the project, interested with intermediate to low power influence. Keep him informed. He was on the project team, so he already knew what was going on. As you can see, she has learned he is the source of inaccurate status to Mike and that Ed was not happy that she was brought in. He believed that he knew better than anyone else what it took to manage the lab, make the lab operational. What does Ed want? He wants to lead the project and direct all the activities as he alone decides. Paula can't give him what. She can't give up control of the project, and she, not Ed, has the proven ability to work cross-functionally. Under these circumstances, this situation has high potential to escalate to a confrontational exchange. Paula needs to stay calm and maintain her poise when confronting Ed. The outcome. In discussing the situation with Ed, Paula learns that he was only trying to help by jumping to Mike directly in hopes of getting more resources on the project. She's able to convey to Ed that his actions have actually had the direct opposite effect and caused further disruption. Paula reiterates Ed's team member role on and the importance of his expert lab knowledge to the project, but he needs to follow the project communication protocol. And Mike is already aligned doing that as well. It is clear Ed quickly transitions between keep informed and engage, manage closely. Mike and Molly can likely assist Paula with that moving forward. Does Paula need to continuously and actively engage Ed with this as this project moves forward? She certainly does. The level of engagement necessary with Ed has shifted based on Ed's behavior. What else can Paula do? Her continued keep informed dialogue with VP Mike will likely provide an early warning system for when Ed reaches around. If Ed persists in doing the end around, Paula should also speak with Molly, who could be unpleasantly surprised by Ed's activities and has the position power to help bring him into line. In summary, identifying, analyzing, and planning stakeholder engagement makes it possible to successfully manage the process. Our key takeaways: stakeholder engagement is necessary throughout the project lifecycle. Reassessing stakeholder power, influence, and interest is necessary throughout the project lifecycle. And when there are problems, you need to address them immediately, being direct and being constructive. I will now pass it back to Rose for some closing thoughts.
So today we've covered the overall importance of managing and leveraging stakeholders to help you become a better project manager. We've discussed best practice on the road to creating your stakeholder management plan, and then viewed some common examples and encounters with key stakeholders and influencers that can affect the project from start to finish. As you digest today's webinar, take a moment to frame the lessons within your own roles and how you can make stakeholder management work best for you. Remember that stakeholder management can be make or break and should be considered from the very beginning of a project. With this in mind, let's finish with this quote here by Patrick Mayfield, an author, speaker, and professional coach. He provides accurate and even cautionary guidance as to the importance of good stakeholder management. You can miss an important stakeholder, but they won't forget you. I'll now turn it back over to Rich to close things out and facilitate a question and answer session.
Thank you very much, Rose. I hope you enjoyed Ken's presentation, and I'd like to invite him back on stage for Q&A, please. Okay. Ken, we have a few questions here. We're going to try to get to all of them. Number one is about prioritizing stakeholders. Outside of their title, how do you prioritize stakeholders in terms of low impact at high interest? Would you mind elaborating on what you talked about earlier?
Certainly. You're right. Title can play a factor, but it's not always the most important factor. That's where the one-on-one, face-to-face interactions are critical to do that assessment of what their influence and interest is in the project. You can then prioritize based on your assessment and that discussion around what level they really need and what role they need to play in the project.
Excellent, thanks. The next one here is about managing relationships between stakeholders. As a project manager or even as a team member, how involved are you in managing a relationship between stakeholders? For example, if two department heads who are not communicating well are impacting your project, how do you go about managing a relationship between those two as the project manager?
Well, that is a challenge. You have to basically, if the two of them are on what I would say polar opposites of what they want out of the project, then you really need to raise that actually as part of your risk assessment and probably facilitate a discussion between the two of them, because frankly, they're probably giving you diverse input as to where they want to see the project go. And so as part of your both your communication planning and your risk management, you'll want to facilitate that discussion and get alignment on how you move forward.
Excellent. Next question we have. Any tips on how to manage stakeholders who are particularly elusive when it comes to communication or just difficult to reach?
Well, in any effective communication, right, you kind of own making sure they're getting the message. So it is challenging. I think from the outset, in terms of the communication, stakeholder management really goes very much hand in hand with having an effective communication plan established in terms of how you're going to communicate with the people, including stakeholders, and what that methodology is. I have found that it's good to make sure that you have the conversation with stakeholders, especially if it turns out that they are a little difficult to reach, that you have established a protocol with them that says, okay, if I can't reach you, whether it's by way of email or phone message or whatever, I'm keeping you apprised of the situation and make sure that they understand that you're moving forward if they don't get back to you.
Sounds like we're bringing the communication planning in there as well.
Yep.
Okay, just time for a couple more here. When it comes to actually keeping track of the stakeholders in your project, what is the best way to do it?
So again, I come back to the communication plan. You're going to want to have that list, and you're going to want to have them in that communication plan factored by, basically the methodology you're going to communicate with them. So, and again, on a regular basis, especially as you follow other best practices of project management, risk management, et cetera, it'll become evident if people are dropping off in terms of their level of interest or influence and new people are coming on. That's why the frequency, you're going to want to make sure the frequency of communication is not overdone, but at a frequency that you can assess if there's changes and how best to continue to manage that communication.
Great. One more here, just before we finish up. As the presentation was going on, we had a running poll about which stakeholder do you encounter most often during your job as a project manager. For you, Ken, would you find that you're you're finding that you see motivator Molly, micromanager Mike, or end around Ed over the course of your career?
I've been fortunate not to have too many end around Eds, but what you do have is, and it's sort of a mix of the micromanager, in that the micromanager may actually go to his functional core team member and be extracting the information from that core team member versus coming to the project manager. So while the core team member isn't intentionally being an end arounder, they're being drawn into it by the micromanager, who, for whatever reason, has more of their functional interest at heart than the overall project goal. When I've run into that, I've had to have that conversation with the stakeholder and the senior leader to indicate to them that they really need to talk to me to have a balanced view of what's going on the project, because you can get a skewed result if you're only asking for a particular functional view.
Excellent. Looks like our poll matched your answer there. We had just one end around Ed, but a full group of both motivator Molly's and micromanager Mike. So.
Oh, very good.
All right. Well, I think that's just about all the time we have for today. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us on our quarterly webinar series. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, you can reach us at www.theflexprogroup.com. Connect with us on Facebook, LinkedIn, or Twitter, and look out for future updates about additions and entries in the webinar series. Have a great day, and thanks again for joining.